Greetings everyone, this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today's video is going to be a continuation of the previous video I did concerning gospel authorship. And this case, I'm going to be covering kind of two areas of this topic. One concerning some of the Jewish, claims that the New Testament makes about the Jews who supposedly, followed Jesus and were healed by him and saw miracles, as well as the authorship of Mark. Now, again, I feel it's important to repeat information that I've mentioned in other videos. And this information, I'm not going to cover it in too much detail, and you can read it for yourself here and pause the video if you need to. So this is something that I need people to understand, that these are things that are historical facts. And in everything I'm presenting, I'm going to be showing how these are historical facts and not simply just stating them and saying that, this is what is true without showing you what I mean by it. So this timeline is also important because this is something I've been saying, that within 2 generations, the original Jewish Christians disappear off the historical map. And I've had people try to argue with me about this, and I think it was I'll do in the next couple slides. I'll be addressing exactly what I mean by this. So keep this in mind, that what I'm saying is not something that I'm just making up, or a claim that I'm making that is the Jewish community against Christians or Christian history, but it's mainly to say, okay, well, when you deal with Jewish Christians, the original group who were supposedly, according to the New Testament Jewish, we should be able to find who they were historically if they had some continuation beyond 2 generations. So, with this in mind, let's ask ourselves a few questions. The Gospels claim that thousands of Jews witnessed the acts of Jesus and believed in him. Well, what happened to them? That's a valid question. What happened to all of them? Especially when the Gospels claim that there were thousands of them. Then the next question I would say is, where are they or their descendants in the second to third centuries? Meaning that you would think that if something is so, such a strong, movement, or has some strong basis in it, for example, that the creator of all things would make sure that it's maintained, especially by the people who supposedly were the first ones to witness such a thing. A good example of this is that Jews of the modern era are descendants of the Israelis and the Jews who received the Torah at Mount Sinai. There's a direct line, of transmission. That also includes the Karaites, for example, who, as I've mentioned in other videos, as well as, genetically, it's been shown that the Samaritans also have a similar, DNA structure, or have similar, genealogy, for example, to modern day Jews. So there has never been a break where every single Israeli that came from Mount Sinai and every single Jew was completely broken off, and that modernly, or at some point in history, a completely different group came in and took over and then claimed to be, A, B, C, and D. No, the modern day claim of modern day Jews is that, modern day Jews are descendants of the, early Israelis, who received the Torah at Mount Sinai. And then lastly here, where are the Gospels of those that the New Testament claims Jesus healed or brought back from the dead? Because imagine if you had someone who everybody saw and it was proven without a shadow of a doubt was dead, and then all of a sudden he comes back from the dead. I mean, that's the story that most people would want to hear, because it's like, okay, well, what did you see on the other side? What happened between the time you died and the time you came back? And then if it's happening on, let's say, more than once, which is like saying it's repeatable, then you want to hear the stories of those individuals. So then that's when you get into, okay, well, why specifically, if you look at the Gospels themselves, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or the claims of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, what's so special about those individuals where their Gospels are considered to be, the ones where, you think, okay, with, there's a guy named Lazarus, who's mentioned in the New Testament, who supposedly, according to the New Testament, Jesus brought back from the dead. That would be the more convincing gospel out of everyone else. Again, if, there was enough witnesses to say, yes, this is what happened. This is what we saw. And this is how we knew he was dead before he went in. And this is how we knew he was brought back to life, and that it wasn't just some hoax. Now, considering this issue, just like the claim that the New Testament makes about this individual named Lazarus, who, again, in the text, we have no idea who, how to identify this person within the Jewish community of the Second Temple period. All that's left of this person outside of the few statements about him in the New Testament, for example, about him being supposedly resurrected, is oral tradition, oral church tradition, specifically oral non-Jewish church tradition, specifically, but nothing concrete from the New Testament itself. For example, the writing that all Christians, for example, accept about exactly what happened to this guy afterwards. We have no information from the Jewish community that the event ever happened, and let alone who this person was, and then let alone what happened to them afterwards. But as you can see, the information here, as I've highlighted here, it says tradition holds that Lazarus became the bishop of what is it? I think Kiltuyon, modern day Larnaca, sorry, on the island of Cyprus. But it's like, okay, well, wait a minute, where are the Jews who saw this? Is there any like written Hebrew, like, or Aramaic, text that explain anything about this person? Did he write anything? According to this, it's all oral tradition about what happened to the person. So in searching this topic out, what I did was I kind of looked at a few, opinions or views that exist within different different areas of the Christian world concerning, why exactly there are four gospels and only four. So I found this interesting site called Stand to Reason: Clear Thinking Christianity, from an article by a guy named Tim Barnett from 2018. And you can read the whole. If you search the whole, if you're Jewish and you want to just know what the opinion is of someone, I would say just read his article. I'm not going to link it, but you can kind of search out the article. The titles here is why there are only four real gospels, and he stresses the real. So he deals in his article with, what I summarize here from his article. So in the highlight, for example, he says, given the plethora of gospels out there, why does the New Testament only include Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? What is so special about these four gospels? So then he gets into his reasons in the article, but he says initially, before he gets into those reasons, he says, simply put, the four gospels are the real gospels of Jesus' life because they were recognized widely in the early church. They are the earliest gospels we possess. They are apostolic, and they lack obvious embellishment. Now, I've showed you in other videos about things that are in the gospels that historically don't match up, or the information that doesn't match up from the Torah perspective and also the Jewish perspective, even the historical perspective. So that last part about lack of obvious embellishments, it depends on what a person means by obvious embellishment, or even obvious. But the idea here is that these texts were recognized by the church, not by Jews, and not by someone you can identify as being Jewish, for example, because as I mentioned before, and as he even mentions above in the article, that there are other gospels like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip. And it just happens to be by certain opinions that those gospels, for example, are not valid, for example. Um, and that, of course, came out of the non-Jewish Christian church, not out of any like Jewish community or any Jewish synagogue that believed this stuff and determined that these are, what's valid and these are what's not, and what the standards were for it. Um, by liking token, as I mentioned in the previous video, and as I'll mention later in this video, you start saying, okay, well, who are these authors? How do I identify them within the Jewish community? And then that's when you find that that information is lacking from a Jewish perspective. So that's how we know that they were, not, no Jews. No, as far as we know, we don't know what Jews were involved in this process. But for the most part, from church history, we know that if there were some Jews involved in the process of determining the texts that were accurate or not accurate, they were very small within the framework of the leadership of the church, for example. So this is when I was doing this search, I said, okay, let me take a look and see what information exists concerning this topic I bring up all the time about how the original Jewish Christians died out within 2 generations of their start. So I found, first of all, this particular site from the Baptist Standard in an article by John Rutledge, and it deals with this issue. So when I read this, I was kind of like, okay, finally, someone's dealing with what happened to the people, and it's called its editorial, "What Became of the People Who Witnessed Jesus' Miracles," and it's from 2014. So I looked and said, okay, he says here, whatever happened to all the people Jesus healed and the crowds he fed? The Palm Sunday throng evaporated. Not surprising, spur of the moment enthusiasm fades every week. The masses cool on political fads quicker than you can say yesterday's news. Now, again, he's comparing this to, what essentially, I guess, would have happened back in the time of Jesus, towards the crowds who saw him. And I find this interesting because, if he's comparing this to, like, I guess, a Sunday service, for example, in modern times, where, let's say, no miracles supposedly happen and no life-shattering things happen, no Roman occupation that may eventually fade away, no leader that's going to like take the Jewish people and rebuild a Torah-based nation, if you will. That's not exactly something people cool off for in the Second Temple period. There are a number of things that, like, for example, didn't cool off in the Second Temple period, including revolts against the Roman occupation, including, the Bar Kokhba revolt, where, Shimon Bar Kokhba was said by some to be, a Davidic descendant, who was leading the Jewish people, who was basically, as some said, he was going to be Mashiach. That didn't cool down. That eventually led to a war, to try to, like, remove the Romans from power, or from, occupation. So to kind of compare it in that way, I find to be quite interesting, where all it took for, according to all the claims made in the New Testament, was just people to kind of cool off politically and say, okay, we're done with that. But let's keep going. And he says, but what about the people who watched Jesus perform bona fide miracles? And what about the blessed ones whose broken bodies he healed, whose wrecked lives would have he transformed? And I was like, okay, yeah, I want to hear more about this. I want to hear what he's going to say about the history of this. So then, and I guess the editor of this, his name is Mark Knox. So Tingy says, do you ever wish Luke had written special chapters of Acts just to tell the where are they now stories? After Easter, what happened to once blind Bartimaeus? Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that name. Don't forget the Samaritan woman, the woman who bled for 12 years, and the synagogue's leader's resurrected daughter. Yeah, exactly. Well, that's my thing. It's like, where are their stories? I'd want to see what these good people have to say about what happened. So then he continues. He says, what about the man with the withered hand, Jairus, and his daughter, the widow and her son, and the crippled man from Capernaum, as well as the grateful leper? What did the 5,000 plus crowd Jesus fed do when news of the resurrection reached Galilee? Yeah, that's also a good question. The Gospels record 37 miracles performed by Jesus, 38 if you include the resurrection. Counting all who dined on divine dinners, thousands of people not only witnessed but also benefited from his miracles. Yeah, now again, he's asking all the right questions, and that's when I was reading this. I was like, okay, I want to see what the answer to this is. Well, I want to see what he says the answer is in this article. But then I got to the end of the article and I started getting further. And I was kind of like, okay, well, I don't see him answering this question because he says, for example, have you ever let your mind wander? Yeah, I'm wondering right now. What's the answer? And then I kept reading. I was like, maybe it's a foolish quest, asking what became of people who received full exposure to the Messiah. But haven't you ever let your mind wander? Haven't you ever wished you knew what happened to the people who witnessed Jesus' miracles, whose bodies received his healing, and whose bellies he filled? Did some of them watch in silence as the Jerusalem crowd called for his crucifixion? Did they, as did his disciples, run and hide? Did they follow him after he rose from the grave? Okay, well, given that there were like supposedly thousands of people, I don't understand why they would have had to run and hide. I don't understand why they wouldn't have said anything. Um, and the idea that he followed them after the grave. Okay, well, still, what happened 2 generations later when supposedly all these people were gone? So at the end of the article, this is what his answer is. It says Easter doesn't last forever, but Easter Sunday doesn't last forever. The sun sets, we sleep, and then rise to a new day laden with temptation, discouragement, challenge, and even happy distractions. Unless we're mindful, the passion, clarity, and joy of Easter fades. We get on with our lives, transformed because Easter, but not much. Transformed because of Easter, but not much different because we forget. So wondering what became of the people who experienced Jesus' miracle can do a Christian good. It reminds us to ask what becomes of us. It reminds us to look at Jesus, to remember Easter, to expect Pentecost. May the bright light of resurrection promise shine in and through our lives long after Easter sunset fades. And that's the end of his article. And I'm like, okay, well, you didn't answer the question. And that's why I say that, obviously there's no historical information to explain any of this stuff because it becomes questionable. As a Jew, I'm looking at this and saying, okay, well, wait a minute. If the comparison here is to a modern day church, and the comparison is Easter Sunday, for example, and what happens after Easter Sunday, I think that's a huge stretch for the following reason. I think my personal opinion would be that in most churches, when people do these like Christian holidays, is that they may, for example, then let's say the numbers go down in like who shows up, for example, but they're still there, and they don't like just disappear completely, or else the churches like would disappear. So a church, for example, doesn't like have people come in for as far as I know, and then like disappear the next day or disappear 2 generations later, unless there's some situation that causes people to say, okay, I don't really follow that anymore, or I follow something different. I don't agree with this guy. I'm going with this other guy over here, so on and so on. This to me is strange because you would think that somebody would have an answer to this question. You would think that if all the things that the New Testament claims, as being some theological, like, reasoning, were to have happened, there'd be more people out there writing more than just 4 Gospels, and there'd be more information. There'd be in Aramaic, there'd be in Hebrew, there'd be all people translating this stuff, and there'd be them doing something different. But again, we already know from what we looked at in previous videos that the theological problems that the New Testament faces with its claims are already huge to begin with. But then when you look historically and say, I'm just looking historical, I'm not trying to argue about, whether, this or that. I'm just looking at what historically did happen to these people. So then I looked a little bit further and looked at some sites to see, okay, well, what other sites can, give me some information about what exactly happened. And I found this website called Medium. Um, and I guess it's from Pacific Crossroads Church. And for example, the information they had about what happened to the Jewish Christians, they had something very interesting. And it says, heeding warning from roughly 40 years prior, the Jewish Christians left the city of Jerusalem as the Roman army advanced and fled to the mountain city of Pella, now in modern-day Jordan, according to the church historian Eusebius. So again, that's, that last part is very important. according to the church historian Eusebius, which is one of the church fathers. So that's not like a Jewish source saying that this is exactly what happened. And I would expect that if he got his information from somewhere, where the Jews who supposedly told him that that's the case. And he says in the last part here that I include, a Jewish Christian community existed in Pella before eventually dying out in the 5th century, at that point known to the other churches for its heretical practices. So this is interesting. So he's saying here that the Jewish Christians who left Jerusalem, who again would seem to have been the ones who supposedly witnessed all these things that the New Testament claims, the ones who supposedly would have been, in my mind, the leaders of the Christian movement, Jewish or non-Jewish, because they supposedly were closer to the event and closer to like supposedly what happened, says that they went to Pella in Jordan and essentially died out in the 5th century, and at that point they were known to other churches for heretical practices. That seems really strange to me. Because again, I would suspect, supposedly, that the authors of the New Testament were made up of this group also, or their descendants, their students, because again, this seems very strange to me. So then I look at another article where it's called from the Wilson Quarterly. It's called The First Jews for Jesus. And it says, what distinguished Jewish Christians from their Jewish counterparts? So part of this article says the following. During the 2nd century, the unique early brand of Jewish Christianity began to wane. Worms writes that as Christianity spread across the Gentile Roman Empire and Jews were taxed in the Jewish-Roman wars, Jewish Christians vanished, either rejoining the Jewish fold or being absorbed into the Gentile church. Again, this is really strange to me because this doesn't make any sense. This does not make any sense, especially given the claims of the New Testament that that basically Peter and what he's building wouldn't die out, and it just doesn't make any sense that the Jewish element would die out, given that they would be the ones who would know Hebrew. They would be the ones to actually have the text of the Tanakh and like know exactly what it means, where the non-Jewish churches wouldn't know Hebrew, and we see that that's a reality today. That essentially all the knowledge about the Hebrew language and about the Tanakh comes from Jews who don't believe in Jesus. Ancient Jewish communities that, were existing during the Second Temple period and before, their descendants still exist today, but yet the early Jewish Christian movement waned and then died out, which seems very strange to me. So now I want to get into my second topic, and that is, who exactly was the historical Mark? And as you can tell already, this is going to follow the same lines as what I mentioned in the previous information. So I looked at like this site called Got Questions that answers questions about Christianity. And when I got to the part where it says who was John Mark in the Bible, it says the following: John Mark, often just called Mark, is the author of the Gospel of Mark. He was and this is the highlight. He was a believer in the early church, mentioned directly only in the Book of Acts. So he's only mentioned in the Book of Acts directly. He's never mentioned anywhere else. John Mark is, I'm sorry, he's only mentioned in terms of, I guess, you know, what this information is saying. And then again, it could be like I'm misunderstanding what they're saying here. Um, but from them saying he's only mentioned directly in the book of Acts, for example. And it says John Mark is the first mentioned as the son of the woman named Mary, Acts 12:12, whose house was being used as a place for believers to gather and pray. Later, Mark is mentioned as a companion of Barnabas and Paul during the travels together, Acts 12:25. John Mark was also Barnabas' cousin, Colossians 4-10. Okay, so again, this brings up the issue I mentioned in the book, the issue of Matthew, for example. None of this information shows how this guy was Jewish, who he learned the Torah from, anything of any real importance that would give me the reality to where say, okay, this is a book somebody's putting in front of me. It's called Mark. Who was Mark? What kind of Jew was Mark? I need to know, because if he was a heretic according to the Torah, if he was not learning Torah, he was unlearned in the Torah. I mean, I can't trust anything he's going to write about, supposedly about what the Torah means or what the Tanakh means. So then, if you continue in this article, one of the things I highlighted here is, however, he did not stay, it talks about when John Mark was a helper of Paul and Barnabas, first missionary journey. That's mentioned in Acts 13:5. But then it says something interesting. It says, however, he did not stay through the whole trip. It says, John Mark deserted Paul and Barnabas in Pamphylia and left the work. So wait a minute, he abandoned them and he wrote a gospel? This is really strange to me. So then if you continue, it says like it doesn't, the I guess the New Testament doesn't explain why Mark deserted, but his departure came right after the mostly fruitless time in Cyprus. Okay, that's strange to me. Only one conversation is recorded in Cyprus, but and then it says later, it could be that the young John Mark was discouraged at the hardness of the way and decided to return to the comforts of the home. This is strange, and this is someone who wrote a gospel supposedly. But I just find that really strange, and I think for me it speaks to itself. If you're Jewish and you're watching this, it's like, wait a minute, what? How's that, someone who wrote a gospel supposedly. Okay, so then it says there, there could be veiled reference to John Mark in Mark 14:51 to 52. Um, and it kind of gives this idea that, okay, well, maybe this is what this part is talking about. This is the fact that this incident is only recorded in Mark's gospel, and the fact that the young man is anonymous has led some scholars to surmise that the fleeing young man is actually John Mark. Again, this doesn't give me any information as a Jew, to look at this and say, okay, well, again, this all was written in Greek. So that has like one, strike against it right there, because again, this doesn't prove to me that someone Jewish wrote this information. But then to see that this is the, excuse me, this is the way that it's understood, of like who potentially wrote it, just based on this kind of information, I find that very strange. So then I looked at another site called the Lifeway Research, and it says the earliest fragment of Gospel of Mark found in garbage dump. So it says recently the Egyptian Exploration Society announced a new document pulled from the garbage pile, from the garbage pile, a fragment from the Gospel of Mark dating from about 150 to 250 CE. This would be the earliest portion of Mark found to date. But the news has come as a disappointment to some evangelicals who had hoped the fragment could be dated as early as the first century. Okay, so again, this is like just like the first one, the Matthew one I went through, where they found this in Egypt. So this one is also found in Egypt. But then you say, okay, well, wait a minute. What about all the texts that supposedly should have been floating around Israel itself? I mean, currently there isn't a lot, in terms of something that would be traced directly back to a Jew, rather than things that we found in locations that are, maybe there were Jews there at the time, maybe there weren't. Maybe this, was something that was written by someone who wasn't Jewish, for example. So then, basically this article continues and gets into these issues about this particular fragment. It says these rumors led the Egyptian Exploration Society to take the unprecedented step of releasing a statement on its publication of the Mark fragment. The EES, meaning the Egyptian Exploration Society, said comparison to other texts led the dating of this fragment to be the late 2nd to early 3rd century CE, or AD is for those who are Christian. It also noted that this was indeed the long rumored piece of Mark's gospel that had previously been publicly dated to the 1st century. Excuse me again. The fragment is only 4 by 4 centimeters and has a few letters on each side from Mark 1, 7 through 9, and 16 to 18, according to Elijah Hickson, a professor and writer of evangelical textual criticism. So what this tells us is that, again, this is not a full document, meaning that, who knows how much of this information actually consisted of Mark. And one thing I want to point out, this the assertion that what it represents is only Mark 1, 7 through 9 and 16 to 18. Please be aware that the chapters and verses, for example, didn't exist back during the first and second century. That was an invention of somewhere around the 1500s, if I remember correctly. So all it's saying is that the information that it contains falls within the modern day parameters of these particular portions, which is not much. I mean, that's not much of like the writing of Mark. So who knows? The writing of Mark may have been a lot shorter than it is right now, in modern Christian history. So again, this is another reason as a Jew, we would have to say, okay, this isn't relevant to us. So the conclusions that I can draw from this are similar to the ones about Matthew. The author of the text does not identify himself by the name Mark. Doesn't say I am Mark and I'm writing this for these reasons to these people, for example, or I'm Mark. My name is Mark and this is my account. The title of the text is based purely on oral Christian tradition. The information in the fragment does not identify any historical details about Mark being Torah based. We don't know anything about if he kept the Torah or not, if he was even a Jew, whoever composed the text itself. The fragment doesn't contain anything identifying its author as being Jewish or even a Jew of valid background or scholarship. That's pretty clear. So again, I have a playlist, or at least two playlists, but this is one of the main ones, where I go through some of the different historical information about, the claims of the New Testament concerning its Jewish origin, also dealing with the idea of what happened to the original Jewish Christians and what happened to them historically. And again, I want to make it clear because I've had people try to criticize, this analysis. I'm not here trying to beat up on Christianity. I'm not like one of those people who are trying to say that, okay, well, Christians, you're bad or, you're doing this and that. My main focus is that, people who are Jewish, who may potentially think about, accepting the Christian concepts, for example, who, for example, are investigating this issue. I'm saying look at the history, look at the Torah, and as I've said before, that this is something that Jews are really, according to the Torah, are not supposed to be involved in. And I think also one of the things that I think a Jew has to be aware of is if a Jew becomes a Christian, the same fate that, for example, like, fell upon the early Jewish Christians of them disappearing because of their own issues, for example, within 2 generations, is normally what happens to a Jew who becomes a Christian. And that's when you look historically over the last 2,000 years, anytime you have someone who's Jewish who has become a Christian, for example, and has accepted the New Testament concept that the missionaries put out there, within a short time, you don't find them being Jewish, and you don't find their children being Jewish, and so on and so on. And that's even to the modern era. I mean, there are a number of, like, for example, high-level, high-name, let's say messianics or missionaries who have Jewish, ancestry, if you will. But then you look and say, okay, well, what kind of ancestry do they come from? They either came from families that didn't believe this thing that they're talking about, or they also came from families that weren't given the Torah at all, which would open the door for them to be able to do these kind of things. And then also, if you say, okay, well, let's take a wait and look approach. Let's see what happens to them within a generation to their children. Are their children going to be like, let's say, you know, legally Jewish, halakhically Jewish? Are they going to be someone you can identify as a Jew, for example? Often the answer to that is no. What happens is they disappear, within the Christian church, or they return to the Torah and become Jewish and continue, and their descendants continue within the Jewish population. So this is Ehav from the Chronicles of Ehav. Thank you for listening. Take care and bye.